They changed their attitude towards war. Back in July, the results of a survey among residents of Russia showed that 57% of the population was in favor of continuing hostilities on the territory of Ukraine. In November, there were twice less supporters of the war, only 25%. The Meduza publication has received the results of the latest closed poll among Russians, which was conducted by the Federal Security Service on the order of the Kremlin. The received data is intended for internal use. The main thing that influenced the change in opinion about the so-called special military operation was the defeat of the Russian army on the front and mobilization.
These figures largely coincide with the results of an October poll by the Levada Center, the only major independent sociological center in Russia. In the Levada report, 57% of respondents were for and rather for the peace talks, 27% were for and rather for the continuation of hostilities, from an article of the Meduza publication.
According to two sources of the Meduza publication close to the administration of the President of Russia, these results of the survey have become the reason that the Russian authorities intend to reduce the number of open opinion polls. This is done to hide the real dynamics of the change in the attitude of Russians to the war against Ukraine. So, in early October, Navalny Love journalists also conducted a survey. People more often began to speak out against the war and their government.
Putin is the main problem of Russia. Do you trust Putin? Not, absolutely, it's hard to say it's censored, all messed up and broken. Now the main problem is that Russia creates aggression on the territory of another country. The position in which he put us does not stand up to criticism. I understand that so far there is no good, prosperous future for Russia, especially after mobilization. In the near future it will be very difficult with both work and study in principle, with everything.
The Russians began to more often speak out for negotiations with Ukraine after the announcement of mobilization on September 21st.
This is sheer reluctance to take part in the war personally. They continue to support it, but they have very little desire to participate themselves. Besides, their support was from the very start something they declared, with regard to what they perceived as having nothing to do with themselves. Life goes on, it's even getting better. Now the risks are greater and people want to start the talks. Still, the majority of people leave this to the government. Denis Volkov, director of the Levada Center, in a comment for the Meduza publication.
И все устраивало ровно до момента.
Everything suited them exactly until the moment when it touched them, because they didn't agree, they did not want Putin to solve any problems at their own expense.
According to sociologists, if Russian soldiers showed successful results on the battlefield, then the Russians would continue to support the war. But because of the defeats in both the Kharkiv and Kherson directions, and the inability to achieve the previously announced goals of the so-called special military operation, the opinion began to change, and continued mobilization could soon trigger a wave of anti-war protests in Russia.
Protests do not occur simply because people think something, but because something makes protest possible. Russia's protest potential is very high. When possibilities present themselves, there will be protests. Quite possibly we won't have to wait that long. Grigory Yudin, sociologist, in a comment for the Meduza publication.
Meanwhile, while in the Kursk region, mothers of the Russian soldiers who died at the front in Ukraine are given postcards and towels. In Yekaterinburg, unknown people set fire to cars with Z symbols. On one of them, they even wrote "For Bucha" with red paint. According to military expert Valery Ryabych, Putin has no plans to abandon military operations in Ukraine, and massive missile strikes on energy infrastructure facilities will be used as leverage to persuade Ukraine to negotiate. In his opinion, this will give time to prepare a new offensive.
Nevertheless, the zeal with which they covered the information space and hammered into the population some postulates is beginning to fall, and now these are the last means that a terrorist state can use.
Also, according to military analysts, Putin has not abandoned plans to announce a new wave of mobilization. It is expected in winter, but it is too early to say how massive it will be. Reported by Roman Smoler, Victoria Sinko, UATV News.